everybody can join in and work through the webinar as we go along. So we're here to talk about managing building safety information at scale. So I will say up front that most of the focus of this presentation is on, and this discussion is on, the occupation phase of higher risk buildings, and also a little bit about mid and low rise as well. We might touch on some of the earlier phase stuff in the Q&A, but really it's about the where the government ministers have finally admitted that the risk sits, which is that sort of occupation phase. What happens when we get these large buildings and we fill them full of people and they do people-y type things within the buildings? How do we manage that process? And that's not the technical way of explaining it, but there we are. The format will be, got a short presentation to go through. I'll be bringing Steve Bunce in, our guest speaker, to elaborate on points. And then the idea is to flip over to some question and answer and try and take as many questions as we can from everybody in the audience. So without further ado, just to introduce, Steve Bunce has kindly accepted my invitation to join me on this call. Steve will introduce himself in a second, but Steve's an amazing guy. This is the first one of these that he's done. And Steve works all day, every day on managing a portfolio of building safety cases. So that's 55, I think, at the last count for Lewisham Council, and herding a group of building safety managers who are working on that endeavour with him, and also with the remainder of the organisation that have line of business responsibility for various things like gas and fire and electrical and all the other bits that we talk about and we in the regime. But Steve's job is to bring all that together into a unified whole that actually makes some sense to the regulator and to residents, etc. So, Steve, do you just want to introduce yourself a second?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, as I say, my name's Steve Bunce. I'm the building safety case manager at Lewisham. We're not an extremely large team, the building safety team. I think there's only, at the moment, there's 7 of us. We're about to take on another 2 BSMs. So we have been operating at a low staff level, but that's probably like most of us at the moment anyway. So yeah, it's a fairly new team, but we were early adopters with the BSR and working with Track My Risks, I think now probably for about 3 years. So yeah, we've taken to digital management as strong as what we can, I suppose. So yeah, and I'm also looking to pick up and learn some things from today. So
brilliant, thanks, Steve. Brilliant. And then for myself, I think I know majority of people on the call, or know of you. So I run an organisation called Track My Risks, which is a software platform that manages golden thread information, and also a brand called Building Safety Register, which sort of started off as not a campaigning organisation, but an organisation to show what the art of the possible might be when it comes to managing huge numbers of buildings. And that's morphed into something that now has a software solution behind it, which talks to the Track My Risks environment, which is for managing safety case reports, Fire Safety England regs compliance, etc., which we can go on to. But really, my world is around managing data and managing information. A lot of it is in relation to building safety. Quite a bit of it as well is in other industries outside. So financial services businesses, schools, hospitals, etc. Really, any type of organisation that is subject to a big, scary regulator that's got a big stick. We've got a regulator in this space now. How big and scary they are, we're not sure yet. How big the stick will be, not sure, or whether they'll use the stick that they've got. But really what we're about is making sure that information is clearly organised, evidentially correct and sound, and has good assurance around it. So hopefully that will make sense as we go through. There are a few other, on that sort of nerdy scale of what we do, other few data sets that we've got, which you may or may not have seen. So one is around our prohibition tracker, which is an attempt to identify and list all of the buildings that have been decanted or prohibited post-Grenfell, either by the local authority, the building fire service, or managing agents just proactively decanting buildings or housing associations. So that's available online. And again, at the end, I'll give my contact details. So if anybody wants a copy of that, I can get that sent across. We've done a lot of work in EWS1 back in the early days of actually trying to understand where are these forms, who signed them, what grade did they give, etc. And that's been used in a lot of media articles. And it's very pertinent now with the recent expulsion of a fire engineer, Adam Kiziak. And then one of the other things we do is we try and track the Building Safety Act legislation and regulations and guidance. And we do that through a thing called the Building Safety Act Resource Centre. So again, that's a free service that runs on our Track My Risks platform. And at the end, I'll give details. So if anybody wants access to that, it's got about 85 live items in it at the moment, and it's all of the underlying regulations and guidance that gets published. And we do all of that with version control. So it updates you when something changes. And again, there's just various free things that we put out into the marketplace to hopefully be helpful. So looking at the scale of the problem, and again, most of the commentary that we see is around high-rise or higher risk buildings, of which there are approximately 13,000. It's somewhere between 12,500 and 13,000 that have been registered with the regulator. Mid-rise is out of scope for the building safety regulator, but there are, according to MHCLG, approximately 75,000 of those. And then when we get to low-rise, all gloves are off. The range is anywhere from 200,000 to about 3 million that I've seen, and I haven't seen a reliable number yet in terms of how many low-rise blocks there are in the country. So we sort of stick with the 300,000 plus nomenclature, but you can actually see that this is a pretty big scope. The important point to mention is that there are different regulations that affect each of these heights of buildings. So again, for anybody that isn't directly involved in this all the time, I'll run through that and just let you know. But the key legislation that relates to building safety information, it pops up in a number of places. So under the Building Safety Act 2022 and the regulations that sit under it, there are multiple references to building safety or information and documents. They seem to be interchangeable. There are different requirements depending on which bit of regulation you read, but the key ones that mention information are the keeping and provision of information regulations. That's the main one. We've got the requirement for provision of key building information, and then we've got the management of safety risks. And they each mention what the accountable person or the principal accountable person needs to do in relation to information sharing or information provision. So it does get pretty complex. I'll try and break it down in a second. We've then got the Fire Safety Order and the Fire Safety England regulations specifically, which have requirements built into them for information provision to both the fire service and to residents. And this varies depending on the height of the building, so back to the sort of high, mid and low rise assumption again. But ultimately, there are requirements in that legislation and those regulations to provide information to other people as the responsible person as opposed to the accountable person. And again, these two names get interchanged, and we even see the fire service interchanging these in the wrong location. But effectively, legally, you have an accountable / principal accountable person under the Building Safety Act, and under the Fire Safety Order, you have a responsible person. They are subtly different. So within the Fire Safety England regs, which came in January 2023, we've got external wall information, so provision of external wall information to the regulator, to the fire service, floor and building plans for firefighting ops, and then you need to notify of faults and repairs to fire and life safety systems. And then the last one, really, and there may be some more obscure ones, but building regulations, Regulation 38, fire-related information at handover. That should be handed over from the contractor or the builder over to the management of the building to allow it to be occupied safely. So again, these do all interact, and they do have a significant amount of duplication between them. And again, this can lead to problems about, really what am I meant to be doing? Which department does what, et cetera, et cetera. But they are all items that need to be thought through when it comes to your sort of information management strategy. So as I mentioned before, high-rise building, you've got the Building Safety Act, building regs, Fire Safety Order, / FSCR, which is important to note. And then when you come to mid and low rise, your Building Safety Act drops away and it leaves you with the other two. But if we look at the Grenfell 2 recommendations, the recommendations from the second phase of the inquiry, they are recommending that the government reviews the definition of a higher risk building. So the potential is that we could come down the height threshold, potentially to bring mid-rise into the scope of the regulator, and we could broaden the use. So, for example, into care homes, for example, or hospitals, wherever we end up going. And from an occupation-based perspective, we could end up drastically increasing the number of buildings within scope. So I think one of the things to consider at the moment is if you have significant mid-rise stock, is to think through either adopting a similar way of working that you do to the high-rise, or at least think through, if that were to happen in a year or two's time, would you be able to respond to managing this information? So some people that we talk to say, well, we've only got one higher risk building. You can kind of manually work around that. If you suddenly make that one become 55 or 100, then all of a sudden your information management problems increase exponentially. I mean, so Steve, where do you fit in that? Because obviously you've got 55 high rise. Well, if you were to broaden that to mid rise, do you know what number that would take you to in terms of scope?
Oh, off the top of me, I believe it would probably add an extra 250 plus. So
right.
5-6 times what we've got at the moment.
Right. So this could be a pretty major, if this change were to happen, this could be pretty sort of consequential to an organization like yours then.
Yeah. Apart from adding to the database, you would have to take on more staff just to actually to manage and monitor.
Yep.
Yeah, it would impact us, not in a good way.
Indeed. Right. Okay. Well, let's pray for a bit of time or warning, whatever they're going to do. So within the Building Safety Act, I think I'm hoping everybody on the course would have heard of this concept of the golden thread. And this was a key plank of Dame Judith Hackett's findings in the Building a Safer Future report post Grenfell, where the concept effectively, just to sort of simplify it, was that information in relation to Grenfell was either absent, out of date, or unavailable to the people that needed it when they needed it, prior to the fire, during the fire, and after the fire, for example. So I think it was a very good concept to say, okay, each building should have this single source of truth where we store information digitally, and again, we can get into the semantic points. Effectively, I think that some people will think of data, others will think of documents. A lot of the legislation talks about documents, but we're holding information electronically in whatever format it is. That information needs to be shared with the building safety regulator, fire service, residents, and other stakeholders. And however you manage this process, it needs to be portable. So when we transition a building from a principal accountable person to a new one, for example, building gets sold or whatever it is, then the information in that golden thread should be handed across to the new party that manages the building or is legally responsible for the building. It sounds very simple, but it isn't. So if I explain the concept and then what's actually happened, I think that might be useful. So conceptually, with the golden thread, that we would have that golden thread there in the middle, that repository of information, that single source of truth of the building, and then organizations and stakeholders would then look at that golden thread. So they would be peering into the golden thread. So it means that the content of that golden thread environment, there's just one copy of everything. That is the live version of whatever that piece of information is. So if the regulator and the fire service were to look at the building and say, I want to look at the FRA, or the safety case report, for example, of building X, on the same day, they would both come into the golden thread and they would be looking at the same version that Steve would be looking at, that I would be looking at, residents would be looking at, et cetera, et cetera. We're all looking at the same thing. And I think that's an eminently sensible, clever way to work. What's actually happened, and largely through legislation, is that we've actually got multiple sources of truth. and I've put in there partial truth. And the reason is because, let's take the building safety regulator, for example. When they request information from a principal accountable person, you have to then take copies of your live information and upload it into their environment. So at that point, you've now duplicated effectively whatever's in your golden thread or the building's golden thread. There's now another copy of that same thing that has been put into the building safety regulators database. The same with the fire service. The same with residents, if you're emailing information out to residents, and same with your suppliers and auditors, etc., is they're all seeing a version that you've sent to them rather than permissioning them into your golden thread. So the supply chain residents and auditors bit, the sort of the southern side of this diagram, in our world, and the way that Steve partially uses our platform, is that you can manage that permissioning. In the northern side of it, so the FRS and the building safety regulator, currently they're refusing to even click on links to this information in the live golden thread. They insist that a soft copy of each of those documents are provided to them. And the legislation says that you've got to keep, actually, I've got a copy of it. If any of that information changes, as soon as reasonably practicable, after the information or document has been created or updated, you need to then provide a copy to the regulator. So again, what the legislation has done is effectively just push this responsibility to the accountable persons without actually giving any assistance in terms of how we make this happen. So there will be, at the moment, for each of these higher risk buildings, a copy of the same information in at least 3 places in all eventuality. But each of those regulators are only looking at a small amount of the content of the golden thread. And I'll come on to a bit more detail about that in a minute. But Steve, does that sort of ring true with how you see it, or are you only looking at the building safety regulator side of the equation here?
We're looking at all parts of it. I mean, at the moment, we link our evidence to our safety case report. So the safety case report will always be a live document. As soon as we update within Track My Risks, it updates elsewhere. But for inviting people in to look at it, we've actually got an example. At the moment, we've got a principal designer where we're having works done on some of our blocks, and they've asked now, because of the gateways, they need to, can we see the golden thread? So I've given them access into it, only into the blocks that they require. And it's read only, so they can't mess anything up, but they can download any document that they want. For us as well, we've actually got the evidence that they've downloaded that document. So if they say in the future, well, this was never made available to us, we can say, well, no, hold up, look, on this date, you took a copy. Also, during the works, some of those documents are going to go out of date. Their shelf life has expired. They've been replaced. The principal designer, by seeing an out-of-date document, can go straight back in and take the new version, because we're uploading it centrally. We've got an internal audit going on as well, and I've allowed them an access that they can actually go into all areas. Again, transparency with that. And then once the residents do ask, they will have it, but they don't need to download documents. But we can also choose the documents that they want. So at the moment, it's working really well. It gives us total control. And as you say, they come to view our documents. We don't send it out to them. So it's always come to us. This is where the latest version will be.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's brilliant. I think while we're on this slide, I think the point you mentioned about residents, and I think this is one that I think in the industry hasn't really been sort of widely discussed yet or fully understood, and that's the significant rights that residents now have under the Building Safety Act to access information. And I sort of went through and read it in more detail again this morning, just to remind myself. And Schedule 2 and 3 of the Keeping and Provision of Information regulations is where you need to look. And there's a line in there which is 2C3 under Schedule 3, or 2C, section 2C, where residents can request the most up-to-date version. So it just says the up-to-date version of the safety case report. So you think, okay, that's fine. Also, you need to provide them with or they can ask for an extract of any evidence relied on in the report, the document containing that evidence, the whole of that evidence, and any document is referenced in the report, that document. So in theory, residents have access all areas to absolutely everything in your golden thread, pretty much, if you're using it to support a safety case report. There are some exemptions around commercial sensitivity, security, and personal data, but they're then talking then about redacted versions. So this whole element, I think, is probably a subject for a further sort of lunch and learn debate, really, because it's such a broad topic. But as and when residents start asserting their rights for information at scale, this takes the conversation we're having right now to a whole other level in terms of complexity, just because of the sheer numbers of residents. If we've got 13,000 blocks with, say, 100 residents in each of them, I can't do the maths on the top of my head, but that's a lot of people potentially needing to be fed with information if they were to all assert their rights, which they probably won't, but it's huge. And there are requirements within the regulations to then keep those residents up to date in the way that you would with the regulator. So again, it does sort of point us towards needing to automate that process in some way. I think the other point just that I've got noted here in terms of the golden thread is that when it comes to the regulator processing this information, so for example, Steve and I have talked a number of times, and we've all tried individually and jointly and everything, to submit information to the regulator that contains links to underlying evidence. And the request is for them to, if you are reading section 24 of the safety case report, for example, and there are 3 links in there to live pieces of evidence, if you're interested in those, please click on them and go and read them. The regulator does not want to work in that way. The regulator wants to send a request for information back to Steve or to whoever, to the accountable person, and then you will then need to take a copy of those 2 of the 3 of underlying pieces of information and upload them as copies into the Building Safety Regulators portal. Now, there are problems with that, which we just mentioned. The other one that I have a real beef with is that they are charging £151 per hour for fee for intervention. If that sort of inefficient process costs an extra 4 or 5 hours, that's another £700-800 that the accountable person is being billed because of the regulator's inefficiency. So we're yet to see what qualifies for recoverable fee for intervention when it comes to the building assessment certification process. So at the moment, they've sort of said, well, in 123 hours on average at £151 per hour, but we don't know, is there another 20 or 30 hours of inefficiency that they didn't bill, or is the 20 hours loaded into the 123? So again, maybe in the Q&A afterwards, if anyone's got any insight into that, that would be really useful to know. When we were sitting down, when this legislation was first being discussed, Richard and myself and the rest of our team, we sat down and sort of said, okay, well, how could this look? What can we look to some other industries to sort of say, how are they managing data? And a couple of areas that we highlighted, but one of them was on cars. I thought that's something that there's lots of them. People understand, and the government provide information systems in relation to cars. So the gold bit on the left, which we'll sort of say notionally is a golden thread for a car, the government provides systems that sort out MOTs, car tax, vehicle identification numbers, VIN numbers, and registration numbers. And there's in multiple databases, but ultimately they are open and they're accessible. They are systems provided by government to manage cars nationally. And there are then third parties that can hook into those via the API. A few of them, for example, are Car Vertical, where you can look at sort of mileage fraud potential. You can look up crash damage, all sorts of things. eBay hook into this because you can actually go in there and you want to buy some wiper blades for the car. You put your registration in, it says you've got a Nissan Qashqai or a Mini or whatever it is, based on the registration, so you know you're getting the correct car parts. Insurers can do lookups, etc. Really sensible way of managing a high volume of transactions with a partnership between government and commercial private third parties. Unfortunately, that's not what we've got in building safety. We've got what was on the previous slide, which is lots of silos of information and nothing that really talks to each other and a lot of dysfunction. I would hope that over time, we will get to a point where we have something that more approaches this, where you've got the providers like us of third-party software providing tools that talk to the government and keep the government systems up to date and in check, so that when you come into one of our platforms and you change your fire door number from 40 to 42, you update your key building information in a platform and it automatically updates the regulator and everything gets kept in check. But unfortunately, all of those connections at the moment are all manual and require you to remember to go and do things in other systems. When we look at going forward in terms of, so where does this back into high risk buildings again, in the occupation phase, where do these sort of, how does this all sort of fit together? I've got the trio of key documents. So for anyone that's involved in the occupation phase, you'll probably know this already, but those that aren't, when the regulator calls you forward for a building assessment certificate, which by the way is the first anniversary of that tomorrow, when that process started, you get an email as a principal accountable person from the building safety regulator, and they say you have 28 days to submit your building for assessment. When you do that, you submit a safety case report, a resident engagement strategy, and a mandatory occurrence reporting system. So you submit 3 documents to the regulator, and you pay them £300 and something for the privilege of submitting it. Each of those master documents, if you like, will probably, in our experience, reference a lot of other documents. So if you take the safety case report, which is the main one, you're making arguments for safety there around fire and structural integrity of the building. The way you say, effectively, to paraphrase it, this building won't pull down for these reasons. One of them is, for example, we had a structural assessment completed last week for the building, that kind of thing. So one of the reference documents would be a copy of that structural assessment. But you don't submit the structural assessment at the time of submission. They will come back and ask you for that. So you may well have 100+ pieces of documentary evidence referenced within your safety case report. Within the resident engagement strategy mandatory occurrence reporting system, again, it's a lower volume of reference documents, but typically with document changes through the year. So for example, if you're referencing a monthly inspection report, at the end of the year, you would have 12 versions of that report. Weekly 52, quarterly, whatever, you do the math. So whereas some of these things, for example, like an asbestos survey, would probably last for ever or for years. So therefore that one of 100 wouldn't change, but a lot of the stuff underneath would churn. So in a typical higher risk building, we're looking at 150+ unique documents per year. So as you're rotating those documents or versioning those documents, you've got to think about version control as well. So where else has this document is version 2 currently? Well, the fire service have got it, the regulator's got it, and 150 residents have got it. When I go to version 3, legally, I've got to update the version 3, all of those stakeholders to version 3. How am I going to do that if I don't know who's got them? Which brings us back to the concept of saying, if I update my golden thread once, if those 150 stakeholders are all looking at the same file, they all get notified that there's a new version. I've met my duty within the legislation. So again, I mean, Steve, run me through again, because we talked about this the other day, roughly how many unique documents you've got across your 55 HRBs.
At the moment, I think we've got the container space for just over 6,500. And this is only relating to the 55 blocks. Some of those will be or won't be used in the future, but what we want to be is consistent across every block, that they've all got the same availability, and the naming protocol, that you go to the same place for the same document in every block. Not everyone's making up their own random names. But again, I think at the moment we've probably got a good 3,000 of them actually valid and containing something. And within that, we're probably monitoring at least 1,500 to 2,000 of them for a variety of expiry dates.
Yes.
Again, like you said, the FARA is done once a year, but for us, well, that's once a year, 55 blocks, all at various months. They're not at the same time. So it's, yeah, we get expiries every day, or at least every week. We will get documents that need replacing.
Yep. Okay. And we'll come on to that in a second about some of the pitfalls of doing that in the lived experience. Right. Okay. So just conscious of time, so moving on. So this is the point I wanted to talk through. So this list was very long. We had to cut it down. But if I just sort of run through how you manage, as you say, your estate of 5,000 or 6,000 pieces of documentation. So the friction point, I think we talked about at length, which is the version controlling, and that, you know, the ability to actually, you know, the difficulty of managing these documents, right? So there's a lot of content in them as well, which we'll talk about, because, you know, it's not just a question of putting something in your golden thread. It's about having that assurance, and I've overlapped some of my points here, but understanding what it is you're putting up, and from a building safety manager's perspective, about what are the potential knock-on implications to the safety case for the building of the content of that new FRA or structural assessment or whatever it is that comes in. And part of that leads to the next point around the distributed responsibility. So that's within a small firm or small organization. It may be that, you know, a person is responsible for all of these different areas of compliance, if you like, or risk. But in an organization like Lewisham, or a large organization, you've got teams of people that, I think in your case, Steve, are not in your line of management control. So effectively, you're a customer or a colleague of those people, as opposed to the boss of those people. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Everyone's got their own sort of areas, and we communicate, but yeah, we have no control or responsibility over it.
Yeah. Okay. So it may well be that, you know, if various people in the organization are not doing their job on time, your golden thread for that particular building lights up like a Christmas tree with everything going red. And that may well be the time that the regulator says, oh, I want to have a quick closer look at that building. But so your team, or you and your team, are responsible for managing those expiries and chasing those people within the wider organization to say, oi, I need a copy of this urgently. Where is it? Have you done it? Is it being done? When's it being done? That sort of process is a lived reality for you, I think, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the BSM is essentially the gatekeeper of the information. They should review, understand everything, and they know if it's coming up to expire. They go and contact, they either look in the location for where the new version should be, or if not, they contact the risk owner and essentially chase them up.
Yeah, brilliant. We talked about you talked about naming conventions a bit before, which is around that whole. You've got quite a smart way of doing it, I think, which is part of the QA process, isn't it? Where you get randomly named files given to you or sent across to you, and then your team rename the file names into a. Can you explain that convention quickly? Because I think it's really smart.
I think we've all opened a folder and we've seen a PDF that's named a mixture of Morse code and hieroglyphics. No idea what's inside it. There could be 10 of them in there, and you have to open every one to try and find out what it is. If you then send that to someone else, they're looking at it and think, well, what's that? There's no sense. So what we do, we check for the accuracy when we QA them. If there's any missing parts, valid dates, valid survey dates or review dates, if there's any inconsistencies, so we can get those corrected. But we always save it in the format of the block name, the document type, and the valid from date. That's it. That's all we want in the title and in that order. Because then if you ever do have all the PDFs in one way, first of all, you can sort them alphabetically. So all of the same block will be within the same group. You can see exactly what the document is if it says type 1 FRA before you open it, and you know the valid from date. So whenever you're handling it, you can tell whether this is the recent version or whether, hold up, look, that's over a year old. There should, I've got the wrong version I've pulled off of it. Allows it for everybody. Very simple, but everybody follows that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say it took a while to get there, and this has been a journey over the last few years, hasn't it? So, right, what is the best way to do this from a Lewisham perspective? What can we get away with? What can't we get away? What will the organisation tolerate? So it's been an interesting journey.
I discovered the naming protocol myself after uploading the first few sort of documents and files, and then just sort of notes and said, look, this isn't going to work for the future. So we were lucky enough to get it in place early, and now we can see the benefits of it now.
Yeah, and I'll quickly mention version control because and this is a number of parts. One, and I know Sue Butcher's on the call, and I'll wave to Sue because she gets even more exercised about version control than I do. These sort of documents that appear from nowhere with no background to them, it's just something appears in the public domain and you don't know kind of what version it is, what changed from the previous one, if there was a previous one, or even what date it was created, because there's nothing on it. And again, we've talked about that, Steve, haven't we, where you're now kicking things back, aren't you? I think to people to say, I want a creation date on it. This is not an acceptable format for me to manage.
There was just a few where I was saving a couple of the PAS reports, and simply on the front page there wasn't a survey date, and I picked that up when I was checking it, but also it wouldn't allow me to save it because I need to put a valid from date in. The system actually forces you to do that. So immediately that I couldn't find one, it's like, right, so I can bat it back to the consultant and just look, can you just return me this with the valid from date? I get it back, it goes in there, and it's a cleansing. And I think by using the naming protocol, whenever you look at that file afterwards, you know that it's been QA'd by someone in the building safety team, so that it's got the information that it needs to have in it, so you don't have to go in and check it again. It's like our sort of little tick box to say, yeah, look, we've checked that. It's good to go, and that's the latest version.
Going on to sort of explain our approach to this, you can see on the screen there. So we work on a parent-child relationship with our software. So effectively, we have this enterprise layer, which is the parent layer. So let's say in Lewisham's case, that's the Lewisham Council strip, which is where you manage content, naming structures, and all those sorts of things. That then gets used to create managed accounts for each building. So that's what you can see on the screen in the background there, which is your own sort of golden thread per building, but you've got a consistent structure to your golden thread based on what you put into the parent account above. And then that information that's held and managed with its expiry dates and version control and everything in the golden thread can be linked through to your safety case report. And there's different software platforms for doing that. We've got one, other people have got one. Lewisham guys use a different one to the one we've got for that part of the process. But most importantly, what you're doing is you're drawing on live data. And effectively, when you update something in your golden thread, you're effectively keeping a consistent naming convention for that container that you're referencing. So although you may have a safety case report that was printed 6 months ago, for example, that's got a link to a fire risk assessment, if that fire risk assessment has changed 3 months afterwards, has been reversioned, you click on that link and you're still going to the same location to look at the latest version. So again, it's all linked, and effectively what you're doing is you're managing all of those items for the regulator as data in platforms rather than one of the ways that the industry has worked up until now is that consultants have built sort of static Word documents, for example, for safety case reports, which if you're managing one and you need to update changes, it's sort of manageable. As soon as you start getting into multiples and saying, we need to update and add another piece of evidence, for example, if Steve was doing this manually, he'd have to go into 55 Word documents trying to do sort of find and replaces. And then he's got to think about version control. So about thinking about how you scale up from one or two up to multiple is really important. The other thing from a golden thread perspective is to sort of labour on that point is effectively the two screens on the left. The far left one on the screen is the reporting interface, which sort of means you can go in and say, show me my 55 buildings and I need to drill into fire risk assessments, for example. The one in the middle is looking at how we manage that content, that global content that's propagated out at the parent level. And then the one on the right is that light blue local managed account for a building. And then they can be shifted across to new PAPs to meet portability requirements. But if anybody wants to see this in more detail and have a play with it, give me a shout afterwards. And then just on safety case reports, again, the screen on the left is looking at the deconstructed safety case, if you like, with all of your different sections and how that links through to the golden thread. And then when you hit a button, it produces a PDF document, which is what you would send to the regulator. But again, however you do it, it's thinking about, is my infrastructure scalable if I've got multiple buildings to manage, or I'm advising somebody that's got multiple buildings to manage. Conscious of time, I would like to click into questions now from the audience, and I'm hoping we've generated. While everyone thinks about that and puts their hand up or whatever, Sue's made a couple of comments. Sue Butcher that I mentioned, which is so the BSR appear to use version internally only and makes you rely on a date for publication. E.g., BSR charging scheme October 23 is version 1. BSR charging scheme April 2025 is also version 1. Yeah, really not helpful. It's a bugbear of mine. It's why we set up the Building Safety Act Resource Centre, because I got fed up with getting email notifications of from the government website saying a document's been published, and you go and look and then you pick through it and you realise, well, actually, this is a new version of something that already exists. But again, it would be really helpful if the regulator was to adopt golden thread thinking itself. But they are new, they are underfunded, they are overworked, they're busy or whatever. Let's hope. So I've got a hand up from Jay Leslie. Do you want to, Richard and Caroline, if we unmute, giving everybody the opportunity to unmute?
Yeah, they can now.
Have a go at unmuting, Jay.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can. Go for it.
Hello, good afternoon. Steve, I've got a question for you, if that's okay. Sorry, Matt.
That's all right.
Have you, when you've been going through documents, you spoke about, in fire risk assessments, maybe not having a date that the work was assessed. Has that ever made you look and think, is this contractor competent? I need to have a discussion with them because basic information is missing that I would expect to have. Or has it just sort of realigned sort of things for you?
Different documents have different parts missing. Sometimes in a fire risk assessment, there might be a confusion between stories and floors, where one might say 13 and it's 13 stories or 13 floors. And it's like, well, which is it? And we need to make sure that this information ties in with the key building information that we've registered with the BSR. What we do there, a lot of the time, they will pick up their information from an internal database, one of ours, and that may have had the wrong information in it then. What we do, when we do find something, we don't only get it corrected for this version, but whatever database was supplying that info in the first place, that gets amended with the new info. So then following on, it won't be a problem. If there was something more concerning that, we feel that this doesn't even reflect the building, we do have monthly meetings with our FRA provider. So we would actually pass on that information to be brought up at the next meeting. But we haven't found sort of incompetence so far. Generally, it's a silly mistake. It could be a Friday afternoon, you hit the key next to the, you hit the 8 instead of the 9. and no one's checked it up before. But
we've all done
that's
it.
where we make the time now.
I think we've had a discussion before, Steve, I think, where again, back to the building safety managers reading what's being provided to them before they publish it. So for example, if somebody comes into a 20-story building to do a flick test or whatever, but can't do above floor 1 or whatever it is, and then you just think, well, that's done, upload the information, we've done our test, but actually there's an underlying issue that needs to be addressed that could undermine the safety of the building. So it's that sort of human QA, isn't there, that I think we talk about of getting the BSMs to actually read and understand the information before they publish it into the golden thread.
Yeah, essentially they need to understand it. They need to know what's actually going on in there, and generally they should be the person that knows the building best. And yeah, if there is, you know, a servicing that hasn't been completed properly, or it's highlighted recommendations or actions, and they can't see that those have been raised everywhere, again, that's where they will challenge back to the risk owner and say, look, are you aware of this? It may be the compliance officer. I mean, if they're going through hundreds and hundreds of emergency light tests, you know, flick tests per month, sometimes, you know, well, I've got the certificate and it's a case of like, I've moved it from there to there without opening it. And that's the problem. And that's where we make sure before it goes into our golden thread, it has to be read. And by changing the naming protocol, that's our assurance that this has actually been carried out. So, you know, one doesn't just slip through.
I think also most importantly, Steve, is that because of the way activity logging works, that you know exactly who from your team put that information into the golden thread on what date and time. So if you do need to go back and say, oi, James, what are you doing? You know, you put pictures of fluffy cats in or whatever, you know where that information came from. So if they're not following you,
I do sort of check it quite often just to make sure, see what's going on. I think randomly we're around about 170,000 logs of some sort of activity since we started with Track My Risks. So yeah, it goes fully back. And again, that's our evidence that we are managing the golden thread in the timescales. We can't just, if an incident happened, we wouldn't just go and suddenly, oh, let's save all the PDFs in that folder there and then say, look, we've got them all. This one, it's all time dated. We can actually prove, yes, that was in place at this time. This is when it was uploaded. Evidence is down to the slightest detail of every action that's been taken.
So moving on to Zara's questions, that's the next one on my list. So how can we verify the integrity of the information in light of the Tri-Fire fiasco? So for anyone that doesn't know or hasn't heard, Tri-Fire, the firm, or the guy called Adam Kiziak ran it, prolific external wall assessor, fire engineer, has been expelled from the Institute of Fire Engineers recently for a number of issues, which we won't go into now, but they expelled him. And it's led to an undermining of the of his work, the consideration of his work by banks and other people. So I think there's multiple parts to that. One, if his work was a part of the golden thread, and a regulator like the building safety regulator had access to 13,000 golden threads, like we proposed they should, going back to the car model, they would be able to, at a keystroke, identify where this guy has been working. Number one, they can't do that. Nobody knows where he's been working. We've got a collection of about 500 Tri-Fire EWS1s. Some of the other banks and lenders have got, 1,000 plus, but nobody definitively knows how many of these things are in the wild. When it comes to, I think to Steve's point in terms of the having well-trained individuals reading content before it gets put into the golden thread, that's another line of defense in terms of, I've just read, for example, a Tri-Fire through, and now I'm reading one from another firm. The one from the other firm is 38 pages and it makes sense. The other one is 2 pages and seems like a load of nonsense, for example. Again, that would be a line of defense. But ultimately, we don't have a systemic way, and I haven't seen a systemic way yet of machines reading this stuff and actually coming up with a view on how reliable it is. I think that will come, but I think at the moment is, if I've got 55 buildings, how many of them have a through? How many of them have EWS1? What grades are they? Who did them? When were they produced? One thing I've seen a lot of, for example, is signed EWS1 forms that are purportedly signed before that version of the form was released. So it's released in March 2022, but the date on the thing is January 2022. So it can't have been signed in January 2022 because that version of the document didn't exist. So there are various checks that can be done. So going on, James Giffin. So, James, brilliant. So James has come in with having received invoice or seen invoices from the BSR, saying that invoices, line item invoices are called things like review of safety case documentation, other less so, such as create a work list or attend a meeting. So these things are all being timestamped and then added to the bill that will end up at the, and he said that lots of skepticism internally about fairness, but right now we're having to accept it. Yeah, I mean, I think really they present a bill, you pay it. I don't know what the mechanism is for querying the charges or what that would lead to if you were to kick back all of the charges that have come from the regulator. James has just popped his hand up, so I think it might be a good point to bring you in on that conversation, James.
Thanks, Matt. All I'll say at the moment is the regulator with the price increase, they've released a publication about their charging scheme and the process for a challenge if you have one. So there is a mechanism there. At the moment, the research that we've done from it, there's a very woolly line that says that they can charge for, quote, and I paraphrase, but whatever is required to get the job done. So it's very difficult at the moment to determine what we can challenge for and what we can't challenge for. But skeptically internally, we're saying, well, if they have an hour meeting, are they just talking about our case in that meeting, or are they talking about others? I find it difficult to accept that they can create a work list and charge us for it. That should just be part of their job. But I think at the moment, and certainly some of the industry peers I'm talking to, the invoices have started landing, and we're kind of just accepting them at the moment until probably somebody puts their head above the parapet and says, actually, no, we're going to push back on this. And then hopefully there'll be some learnings from that. But I just wanted, it's really just anecdotal information for the team.
So the theory holds true that if you were to present a beautifully presented safety case report with no gaps in it, with full information, et cetera, in theory, they should be able to review that quicker than one that's a complete mess and hard to read with missing information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm more than accepting of the fact that because this is all new and we're all sort of learning as we go, some of ours might be, to your description, a complete mess and difficult to read. I'm hoping that we're in the fullness of time, better information will come out, and what good looks like will become more apparent to more people. Some people have obviously managed to get them, which is great, and I applaud those individuals. It feels a bit difficult at the moment that we can get invoices for the time that they're spending on things, and we get these RFIs, these requests for information, as you alluded to earlier. And I'm hoping that eventually we'll give them all the information that they want. They'll stop charging us, and then we'll know what good looks like. But we're at the moment just getting invoices. And I think if you spend, I know of individuals that have spent £10,000–15,000 per safety case before and have used consultants, and they might be all singing or dancing, and they might have very limited reciprocal charges from the regulator because everything's all in place. We were perhaps the other way around. We tried to do them ourselves, and we might end up spending a bit more money with the regulator because they're spending more time and hours, and maybe that's how it balances out. But we will find out, and I think maybe that's something we'll come back to as another session in terms of that part of the process once more is known. So thanks for that, James. Sue's dropped in with a comment about writing an article about version control, series of articles, videos about information management, blah blah blah, written in plain English. So that's great. So again, I think that's something that we might ask you to come on for, Sue, at the appropriate moment. So I think so it leads me on, because we're conscious that we're getting towards the end of our hour. So what I'm trying to do is keep these lunch and learns within the hour, fast paced, hopefully covering a lot of ground
quickly. But the plan is to do them again. So chatting to my team, we have come up with this concept that we're going to do one of these on the first Thursday of every month. So the idea is that we just build a community of people who want to come along and do it. And if you've got an idea of a topic, let us know. If you'd like to come and speak on one and be part of the panel, that would be great. But I think by forcing myself to do this every month, assuming that people want to come to it, it gets me into the habit of, rather than just doing one and then disappearing for 6 years. So I can see Sue's clapping and got some thumbs up, so that's good. So that's the first thing. So diary dates, first Thursday of every month. We will be sending out an email after this with a booking link to book in again. That will come in a while. The other thing I mentioned, the Building Safety Act Resource Centre. So for any of you that don't have access to this at the moment and would like it, if you just send me a message directly or send it through to help@buildingsafetyregister.co.uk, we'll invite you to it. There's 331 people that are accessing that currently within the industry. So again, we'll just, I try and update it or get it updated as often as possible. It won't always be the moment the advice comes out, but fairly soon I'll go through a batch of updates. We've got, if you want to schedule a call with me to talk about any of the things we've talked about, or just get a sanity check, or just talk about the weather or whatever, then again in the post-event email there's a link to book a slot in my diary, so you can just click on a link and we can talk about a specific issue. I'm sure if anyone's got anything for Steve directly, if that either comes through me or directly to Steve, you're on LinkedIn, etc., aren't you, Steve? So I'm sure you'd be happy if anyone wants to connect with you and ask a question.
Yeah, no problem.
And really, so I need to wrap up. I need to say thank you to Steve, and it's a good job I didn't mention at the start, but it looks as though your deliveries didn't arrive within the 4-hour window within this 1 hour of the 4 hours. So Steve didn't have to go blank. So that's all good. And yes, there are conveyancers and lawyers and housing associations what to look out for. Right? Okay, maybe we can have a separate discussion about that and do an event. And Callum McQueen, do you want to come in with the last word with a quick question? I've noticed you've got your hand up.
No, sorry, Matt. I was trying to send a thumbs up and clicked the wrong button. Yeah.
Accident, but it's lovely to talk to you anyway, Callum. We must catch up soon. So with that, I will leave everybody to their lunches or whatever they're doing. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully, if I don't speak to you before, we can all see each other again on the first Thursday of next month, which is May, I believe. And we will send out information to everyone as well. We'll send a copy of the presentation and the recording of the call. Speak to you all soon. Thank you.